hear me with the speaker system?
Yeah.
Dana?
Yes.
Okay.
And I wonder if it's when you tilt your head up, you're tilting away from the microphone.
Well,
Not that
it's
I'm
weird
trying.
because this device is the one where I usually use headphones.
Oh,
The other
okay.
one, the speakers usually work great. And I was in a meeting last night and they said there was a little audio glitch. So I don't know if there's, but thankfully I have multiple computers. So as long as we're good now.
We are
Yep, you
great.
sound
And then,
great.
yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to mute. We're
Do you need me to redo? Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Okay.
I mean, I am an editing wizard now, so I could use what we had from before. So why don't we do that? And then from, why don't you do like, and I'm going to hand it over to you. So I have a nice place to start at least Stacey's story, and then I'll see what I use. Okay.
So just me saying, handing it over to Stacey. Okay.
Mhm. All right. Mute me. We're recording.
All right. I am so excited to hand it over to you, Stacey.
Thank you, Dana. Thanks, ladies. It's really good to be here. And as Dana was talking about my story and talking about, or my bio and talking about how I'm passionate about public speaking, I lived in silence with my addiction for most of my life. So it surprises me that I was this excited to get on a podcast and talk publicly about my story. It surprises me that I now teach workshops and on addiction and recovery rooted in my story. So I'm really glad to be here. A couple things I want to put out there before we get started. First, I identify as an equal opportunity addict. I have not yet employed every addiction, but I've employed enough addictions to have a sincere respect and appreciation for the disease of addiction. I've also done a lot of research. It was really important in my recovery journey to understand what addiction was. How did that happen? And so I've looked into the science, what it does to the brain, and I've also looked into what the medical or mental health community is saying about addiction. They no longer use the word addict and addiction. They use substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorders. There's a lot of disorders there. I do think there's power in language, but I think there's more power in just honest, vulnerable dialogue. So when I talk about my story, I just use the words addict and addiction. Like a lot of people, my story began before I was born. On my mom's side of the family, my grandmother was born in Ukraine. Actually, both of my biological parents were born in Ukraine. During World War II, my biological grandfather was killed, and my grandmother found herself in a displaced persons camp in Germany. This is where my mother was born. She and my mom came to America on a boat, speaking no English. There was actually a story that some man on the boat tried to buy my mom from my grandma during these times. Obviously, that didn't happen, thankfully. They got to America, and my grandmother met another Ukrainian man who had fought for the Ukrainian underground, and he had a lot of trauma. And that trauma resulted in alcoholism. And so she grew up, my mom, in a very abusive, violent, alcoholic home. I didn't know any of this until I was about 19 years old. She hung on to those secrets until much later in life and honestly never really came to terms with any of them. On my dad's side, there was a history of compulsive gambling. Again, I knew nothing about this growing up. My grandfather owned a bar. My dad would bartend. This was back on the East Coast. And he owed some really dangerous people money and wound up actually leaving the state and moving to Nevada to get away from gambling, which Nevada was not the best place to come to get away from gambling, but there's there's layers there. And I always thought it was odd because born and raised in Reno, Nevada, we were the only family in the state of Nevada. We had family down in Southern California on the East Coast. I didn't find out how we landed here again until I was like 19 years old. So I grew up in a house, there was no drinking, there was no drugs, but it wasn't necessarily a happy childhood. Lived below the poverty line until I moved out on my own, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. There was a lot of tension, financial stress. I remember sports being a very tense time, lots of yelling, screaming, crying, and a stack of pastel colored cards next to my dad every time there was a football game on. And I didn't know that those were parlay cards. I didn't know that he had money on the game. I just knew it was tense. And to this day, it's actually funny. I was a head cheerleader as a freshman in high school. To this day, I don't know where the ball's going, who has it, who's on offense, who's on defense, what a down is. Like, that lasted 1 year and we were done with that. My parents valued education, and I don't know how they funded this with what they had financially, but I went to a private Catholic school, first through 12th grade. And so I always felt like an outsider in my neighborhood. I would go, leave home to go to school in my little Catholic schoolgirl uniform. So I looked like the richest kid in the poorest neighborhood. And then I'd get to school, and the kids at school, their parents were doctors and dentists and lawyers and casino owners. And I felt like the poorest kid at the richest school. And so very early on in my life, I found myself trying to figure out, how do I fit in? Not who I am, but how do I fit into different situations? How do I present myself externally to the rest of the world? Fast forward till I was about 12 years old, I started babysitting, and there was a couple who lived in our neighborhood who were swingers, and I was exposed to a lot. I'm now the mother of an 11-year-old girl, and when I think about what I was exposed to at her age, it's painful, because I think for a long time I blamed myself for that too. Like, you were 12, you were old enough to know better. Well, they made me feel like a grown-up. They made me feel wanted, and I didn't feel wanted at home. So I grew up with very unhealthy adult role models and very little guidance. And so I was going to figure it all out on my own. When I was 15, my parents divorced, and my mom, so when I was just a little before this, my dad had a massive heart attack, triple bypass surgery. Both of my parents were very heavy smokers at that time. And as soon as he had his surgery, he quit smoking. 15, working at a store. I don't know if you guys had this where you live, service merchandise. I'm definitely aging myself by even referencing it. But my mom came to pick me up from work, and she was chain smoking in the car, tears pouring down her face. I knew something was wrong. And she told me that she and my dad were getting a divorce. And I remember the feeling of my teeth biting down on my tongue, because I knew she was hurting, but I was so glad, because there was so much tension there and so much anger. I was relieved. She did not deal well with the divorce. And so she had this newfound freedom, and she started gambling a lot. I live in Reno, Nevada. There's casinos everywhere. This was before there were things like cell phones. She would go to the market at 5 o'clock, say, I'll be back in a few hours. It would be midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I'm calling hospitals and I'm calling police departments to see if there'd been an accident. And after a while, I got smart and I started calling the Atlantis Hotel and Casino and having her paged, and there she was. So I knew gambling was an issue. I didn't understand gambling was an addiction. I grew up understanding when I was 19, I understood my dad had a gambling problem too. But as I grew up, I found gambling to be a waste of money, a waste of time, and I wanted nothing to do with it, because I watched it destroy her. When I was about 18 or 19, I was a freshman in college. I was the first in my family to go to college. I was going to make a name for myself. I was going to become something other than where I had came from. And I was going to do that by getting degrees and getting letters after my name and making I hadn't dealt with any of the internal stuff. I was going to present externally as something better than I thought I was. And while I was I believe it was my freshman year of college, I was living with my mom, teaching preschool, making $4.25 an hour, $4.27 when I got that big pay raise, and going to school full time. And my grandmother got sick, and she was on the East Coast. And so my mom bought a round trip ticket to go check on her mom. She got back there, and my grandmother got a cancer diagnosis. And I remember my mom calling me and saying, I'm not coming home. So I was there. My mom was also a hoarder, which complicated things even further. So I was there in Nevada by myself, going to school, and my mom's not coming home. And then my grandmother died. And then it was, I can cover rent for you for 1 month, and then you're going to need to move. So all of her belongings, all of her stuff, all of her, and it's funny because at that time it felt like all of her physical baggage was placed in my lap for me to deal with. I didn't realize all of her emotional baggage was also placed in my lap for me to deal with. So I had 30 days. I found a full-time job working graveyard in a group home for developmentally disabled adults, which was hard work and very humbling. And then I went to school during the day and I was instantly thrust into adulthood. And we all hear that saying, fake it till you make it. I'm going to call bullshit on that. It doesn't work. I was faking being an adult and I had no idea what I was doing. I had no guidance. And so again, I presented as though I was an adult. I dressed like an adult. I tried to talk like an adult. I put myself in massive credit card debt trying to look like an adult and again, seem like something other than where I came from. At 23, I graduated with a degree in education and I started teaching high school English. And I was very ambitious, and I really think that drive came from my childhood. Within 3 years, I was promoted to department chair of the largest English department in our school district. Let's see where I was going with this. Yeah, so department chair, in my mid-20s, I reconnected with my high school sweetheart. He felt very safe. He had a 6-year-old daughter whose mother had fallen into the grips of addiction. She was an alcoholic, she was a drug addict, and she had completely spiraled out of control. Unfortunately, that woman passed away a few years ago at the age of 49 due to cirrhosis and pancreatic cancer as a result of her addictions. So my high school sweetheart and I reconnected. I fell in love with his daughter. I was getting older. I wanted children, and I had PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, one of the leading causes of infertility. So I didn't know if I'd ever be able to have a child of my own. And I wanted the appearance of everything. So we started dating. I decided I was going to go for a master's and got a master's in education, moved up and became a dean at the age of, I don't know, I was in my late 20s. And we went and bought a house, and it was a beautiful house in a golf course community. And this house is a pain point for me that you'll understand in a little bit. From the outside looking in, I had everything. I had a good looking husband, a beautiful little girl that I was in love with, this amazing, huge house with the golf course right down on the corner. And inside, I was completely broken. When we moved into that house, I herniated the first disc in my spine. So I have degenerative disc disease. And when I herniated that disc, I started getting easy access to opioids. And opioids not only treat physical pain, but when you take them in the beginning, it takes away all the emotional pain. The problem with opioids, and I'm not a doctor, so when I explain this, I'm throwing random numbers out, but your brain has, we'll say, 100 pain receptors in it to start. And this is the way that the body notifies you, okay, something's wrong. Well, in my case, as I started taking more and more opioids, my body's natural defense mechanisms started creating more pain receptors. So each time I upped my dose, my body, to protect itself, created more. So towards the end of this problem, which I'll get to in a little bit, I had thousands of those pain receptors. And it makes opioid detox extraordinarily painful because now all of that is exposed. Plus, I hadn't dealt with any of the emotional stuff. So all of that is now bottled in, and it all came to a head in a few years. So 2009, we finally got married, and 2009 to about 2015, I would say the abuse, misuse, and start of my opioid addiction really progressed. That wasn't 2015, 2012. In 2012, I found out I was pregnant. I'd actually made an appointment with my doctor because we were talking about doing back surgery. And I wanted to see if there was any chance that I could have a baby before I went the route of surgery. And the doctor's doing the exam and he says, do you want to know something? I said, what? He said, you're pregnant. I almost yelled at him. I was like, why would you joke with a woman with infertility issues? Like, what is wrong with you? And then I heard my daughter's heartbeat. And that changed everything for me. I had been a smoker. I quit smoking that instant, got off the medications, thankfully was completely healthy during the pregnancy. And that year proved to be a life-changing year. In May, my grandfather, mom's dad, passed away. In September, so September 22nd, my daughter was born. Amazing time in my life, very exciting. But I could tell my husband wasn't as excited. His drinking started to increase. I started to realize there was a problem there. I think on some level he had banked on my infertility issues. He'd already brought one child into the world. And so there was a sadness there because I'm overjoyed and we're not in this together. In November, so a month after my daughter was born, my mom wound up in the hospital. And initially it was for dehydration. And then a few days later, it was like 11 o'clock at night, I get a phone call from an ICU doctor saying the prognosis is really bad. You need to get back here. She slipped into a coma. I was never able to speak with her again, but I got on a plane the next morning at 6 a.m., went back to New Jersey, had to leave my newborn baby at home, which meant I wasn't able to breastfeed. Like there was all sorts of new mom stuff going on and anxiety. Our personal finances were very tight at that time. So I'm staying at some just grungy motel down the street from the hospital, completely alone, went and bought a pack of cigarettes, started smoking again. Was there for a few days, got things settled, came home, did the holidays with my family. And then the 1st of January, my now ex-husband and my oldest, she's still my daughter, she's my stepdaughter, but she's still my daughter. My oldest, Lindsay, at that time was in just entering, no, she was a freshman in high school. So she stayed home with my dad, and my husband and my newborn went to New Jersey to put my mom in hospice. And a few days later, my mom died. And that's when things spiraled. And within that time, my grandmother also died. Like it was just one hit after another. All the walls were coming down. And I remember standing outside facing the Hudson River, looking at the New York skyline. I think it was the day of my mom's funeral, and calling my doctor saying my back's bothering me again. And the prescriptions started coming in, and I had an MRI to justify it. And so I was getting really heavy duty prescriptions. This was before pharmacies shared records. This was before doctors had access to records. And so my doctors became my drug dealers. And it messed with my mind because 100% of my addiction was funded by my insurance and prescribed by my doctor. So even though there was that little voice inside of me that was saying, all right, something's wrong here, I could logically rationalize all of it. You're not out on the street buying drugs. You're not shooting up heroin. Towards the end of my opioid addiction, I was taking fentanyl, morphine, Norco, all simultaneously, all prescribed. And so it's important for me to distinguish, even though my drug addiction was prescription, when you're dealing with stuff like fentanyl, it's just like dealing with heroin. Like it doesn't make me any better or any different than someone who's dealing with an illicit street drug. So while this is going on, my pill popping is increasing. My husband's drinking is increasing. I'm seeing his problem and identifying the fact that he needs help, but I'm not seeing my problem yet. So my first 12-step meeting was Al-Anon. And it's ironic to look back at that time now because I'm there, oh my God, my husband's an alcoholic. What do I do? Not realizing, oh my God, I'm an addict. What do I do? And in February of 2015, so my youngest, Olivia, was 2.5 at that time. Lindsay was in high school, in the throes of all the high school drama. My marriage was falling apart, and I collapsed in my bedroom closet. And I went to the hospital. I thought I was there for a day or two. It turns out I was there like 4 or 5 days. And that whole experience, to this day, it's very blurry and foggy to me. But what's interesting is when they discharged me, no one said, you have a drug problem. They gave it some weird like 15-syllable diagnosis that I didn't know what it meant. It had something to do with the liver. And so it still didn't hit me like, Stacey, you need help. And a few days later, I was in the supermarket. I remember the aisle, canned food aisle, and I had a flashback to being in the hospital admissions office and my goddaughter, who was about 20 at the time, seeing me in a wheelchair hallucinating. And it was in that moment, oh my God, I am not okay. And I went home and I said, I need help. And a girlfriend of mine had gone for treatment for alcoholism exactly 9 months to the day prior. And it was ironic because I found the treatment center for her. And the next day she wound up driving me to that same exact treatment center. So I did 2 weeks of detox. Opioid detox, like I said, is ridiculously painful. It's something, can you do it on your own? Yes, it won't kill you to go through it. The only two drugs that will kill you or can kill you through detox, benzos and alcohol. Opioid addiction, you can detox, but it's horrible. So I did that for 2 weeks, came home and had this sense of, oh my God, look at me, I did this, this is great. I wanted nothing to do with 12-step programs. I did try a couple NA meetings, and the only requirement for a 12-step meeting is a desire to stop whatever it is that you're going there for help for. And so you would sometimes get people who were really high on really intense drugs, and I didn't feel comfortable. I tried AA meetings, but I felt like an imposter because alcohol wasn't my issue. And so I decided to go the outpatient counseling route. And I did that 2 nights a week for about 18 months. During that time, I'm going through this. My husband's drinking is going up to here. I'm getting some sobriety, some clarity. Things at home were really unhappy. And I could tell our marriage was coming to an end, and I didn't want to be at home. So there was this tiny little storefront casino in our little golf course community. And I would go there and hide out and play nickels, and feel guilty about playing nickels. Oh, actually, before I move, there's a big piece of this I forgot. When my mom died, I came into a very large inheritance that enabled me to pay off my house, pay off my student loans, and not have to go back to work. And I was able to stay home with my daughter. And that's a big piece of this puzzle. So I'd go to this little casino and I would gamble. I hated gambling. Even when I was doing it and I started, I didn't get the appeal, but it was just a place close by where I could go and I didn't have to be at home. And I remember the moment that I felt the first dopamine hit. And I was like, huh, I get why people like this now. And all of a sudden, those 5-cent bets went through the roof. So this started towards the end of 2015. My marriage ended on Thanksgiving Day of 2015. I had a lot of money in the bank and didn't have to work at that time. And by the end of 2016, I was broke. I had lost everything. I was borrowing money. I was selling items. Everything was gone. And there's a page in, if you've ever read 12-step literature, that talks about pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization, and that's where I was. And I tried to stop. I went to counseling. I did EMDR therapy. I did hypnotherapy. I banned myself from the casino. And then my addict mind found a way to work around it. Well, as long as I don't win more than $1,200, I'm not going to have to fill out tax forms. So I would calculate the maximum amount that I could bet so that I wouldn't put myself in that position. I would leave therapy sessions and I'd feel great, like, all right, I got this. We're not going to gamble. We're okay. And I would get in the car and my car was on autopilot. Like when I say I couldn't stop, I can't stress it enough. I couldn't. And it was so frustrating because with the opioids, there was a physical dependency. There was a pain there that I was afraid of feeling when I went into detox. This one, it wasn't the same. And it didn't make sense to me why I couldn't stop. I tried a few Gamblers Anonymous meetings. I would go in, I would cry. I would think these people can't help me. They're not like me. They're all like in their 60s, 70s, 80s. They don't get me. And I would drive straight to the casino. So like any good addict, I decided that that would be a great time to start dating. So in May of 2022, I put myself out there, and I met a man, and, you know, we went on our first date. It was fine, whatever. And then as I got to know him, he had 8 or 9 years of sobriety and recovery through AA. And so I shared with him my opioid experience, not the gambling. That was a deep, dark secret that nobody knew at that point in time. But I found his sobriety and his recovery to be so attractive, and I wanted that. And so one night I remember sitting out on my patio, and we're texting and we're flirting, and he says, tell me a secret. And I'm sure he's expecting something, you know, hot and steamy. And I remember sitting there and taking a deep breath and replying, I have a gambling problem. Kind of changed the mood of the conversation a little bit, but he handled it like a champ and invited me to go to an AA meeting with him on Zoom. And so I started doing that. And then I got some free play in the mail, because casinos love to bring you back in. And I got the free play, and my addict mind said, it's not your money, it's okay. And so I went and played it. And then I was right back in. And this went on for a few weeks. The man I was dating, I did share it with him. There was at least that one person I was honest with. And then went on for a couple of weeks, and I gambled and I won. And so you would think I gambled and did the thing I went there to do, I would feel great. And I felt horrible. I had to lie to my ex-husband about why I was going to be late picking up my daughter. I knew that there was no amount of money that I could win that would ever recoup my losses. I felt like a failure because I had a little bit of abstinence and I'd blown it again, and I was done. And so for the first time, I was able to see it clearly, and I realized I needed some serious help. I think my first 30 days were all in AA because I couldn't find a GA community that I felt like I fit in with. And it's funny, I live in Nevada. You would think there would be gambling addiction recovery everywhere. There was one center in Reno, Nevada, and it had shut down. People don't talk about gambling addiction. They don't really understand it. And the crazy thing is, it's on the rise now with legalized sports betting, internet gambling. It is everywhere that you go. Like Dana had asked me, you know, how do you live in Reno of all places? Because it doesn't matter where I go. Wherever I go, gambling is. And so GA saved my life. I started going to meetings every night. I still do almost every night. I started talking with my oldest daughter very openly about my experience. I started opening up to some professional connections very cautiously, and it was all very well received. And once I started to get some footing and get some serenity and really start to heal and deal with my issues, I decided I wanted to bring it into the construction industry. And so I put together a leadership development class, and I decided that would be a great place to talk about it. And I pitched it to my boss, shared my story with him. He was completely supportive of me bringing it in. And from there, I've started speaking publicly about it, trying to bring awareness to it. One thing I left out that I do want to include is when I went to outpatient counseling, the therapist asked me, he said, you know, what do you see in your brain when you think of the word addict? And I described the degenerate on the street, dirty, unkempt, homeless, smelly. And with all of those descriptions, there were all sorts of judgments attached. Those were all the judgments I had about myself. And he looked at me and he said, no, it's you. And I said nothing, although mentally there were all sorts of F-bombs and fingers flying, like, how dare you call me this? But it's true. And so when I did my first workshop on addiction, I ran a Google image search on the word addict. And the images that popped up were the exact images that I used to see. And so my goal is really, and I've got a cat that may be visiting us here in a second, my goal is really to change the face that people see when they think of addiction. It is a disease. It does rewire your brain. It does not discriminate. It doesn't care how much money you have, what color you are, what age you are. Everyone can be impacted. And like for my oldest daughter, she's at high risk. It's in her genes. It was in her childhood and her upbringing. And there's a lot of trauma there. and she has some of the thought patterns already. And so we talk very openly about it. I think having the awareness of what your risk factors for addiction, I think that's just important as knowing what your risk factors are for heart disease, for colon cancer, and we need to approach it that way. My youngest is 11. She's nosy and she's perceptive, and I do GA meetings from Zoom. So I'm sure there are many times she's sitting on the stairs eavesdropping. She doesn't know yet, but she will. And I think that there's something so beautiful about being able to take my pain and give it a purpose where I can help others. And so I really, really appreciate you guys letting me come on today and talk about this.
Oh, Stacey, thank you so much for sharing your story. I knew a lot of it. I didn't know a lot of it. So I appreciate your vulnerability and your authenticity for sharing so much with us. I think your story is going to speak to a lot of our listeners. This is the first that we've had anybody on with the gambling addiction. So that's been an eye opener to me as to like what we were talking about with, you know, like you're living in Reno, how does that work? And then you were like, you go to the grocery store, there's alcohol there. How do you do it? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, right. So yeah, it's an amazing journey. So thank you for sharing. I'm sure Heather and Meredith have questions. So I'll let them chime in.
Thank you. I don't know if you've listened to my story, but there are a lot of parallels, like, you know, calling, yeah, Meredith too. You know, we both have moms that were in active addiction when we were kids as well. And so, you know, calling and trying to figure out where your mom is, them not coming home, you know, like for me, my mom was always trying to fill that hole. And, you know, also kind of that trauma response of the ultra independence. That's what it is. Ultra independence is a trauma response. And, you know, we think, well, it was a survival response as well first. You know, that is how I got through. So when you talk about these things about being successful and doing a lot of us are. We're very good maskers. We're also, all those skills that we have make us really good at what we do. But what could we do without that, right? Like we're already dimming our own light, but we could be, you know, like this is the whole double-edged sword of addiction, right? But the trauma response that you talked about and the ultra independence, and then how much that changed when, I don't know if that part changed, but what your life changed when you had your kid, when you had your sweet, you know, on September 22nd, you had your youngest. And like, I got sober for my kids. I couldn't get sober for myself initially, but I got sober for them, and then I stayed for myself. So there was a lot of these kind of pieces that, and then taking it into your everyday life. Like, this is also what I was already a therapist, but I didn't specialize in addictions. I actually avoided that at all costs. And so I worked in domestic violence to just re-traumatize myself, you know, tried to fix all the things that I wasn't fixing, right? No, don't want to deal with addictions. Like, no. And now it's my favorite place to be, to work with, to change this podcast, to change the face of addiction. It does not discriminate. To have conversations, because guess what? Connection is what is the opposite of addiction, right? Isolation. And it gives us that dopamine hit that we all need, because I found out that not only do I have trauma and I have addiction, I'm also ADHD. And so I was like, yeah, it's the trifecta. This is what I specialize now in: trauma, addiction, and ADHD. And everyone was like, oh yeah. And I'm like, but you have one or two or three. I have all three, you know.
CPTSD, I've got all sorts of labels.
Yeah. I love what you did with this in your work industry. So that part of it is really, really different from any other guests we've had. And so I'd love to hear how that's kind of worked, or what it looks like, and yeah, and the women involved in that as well.
Well, it's very new. So I just started integrating it into our curriculum last year. Now I'm making it part of our regular programming. And I had decided, okay, I don't know where I'm going to go with this, but I want to go with this. And I actually met Dana at a mental health and construction conference in Kansas City earlier this year. And it was a brief meeting. We sat at the same table. I complimented her fabulous style. There was this vibe she gave off that I just really, really liked. And then unfortunately, before she spoke, we had bad weather in Reno and I had to fly out early. So I didn't get a chance to hear her story. And I decided to take this conversation to our national association. And the VP who oversees health and safety is someone that Dana has a relationship with. And I said, you know, we're not talking about this and we need to be. Construction is the second highest in terms of addiction out of any industry, which directly correlates with the fact that we're also the second highest in any industry in terms of suicide. Gambling addiction alone, 1 in 5 attempt suicide. And so I had this conversation with him and he said, oh, I know this woman. I want to introduce you to her. And I told her, Dana, last week when we were talking, I said, part of me was like, damn it, I want to do this on my own. It was that hyper independence. This is my idea. And then he introduced me to Dana and I was like, oh my God, I love this woman. Every time we talk, I just get this synergy and excitement because our stories are different. Our journeys are different, but our values, our beliefs, what we want to do with this is exactly the same. And so I don't know what it's going to look like in the future. I don't know if we're going to build in Nevada and bring it out nationally or start nationally. We have 68 chapters around the country, start nationally and trickle down. But I want to talk about this. I want to get other people talking about this. So it's very new. It's very new. I'm really excited to see where it can go and who we can help. I will tell you, when I did my first workshop last fall, I introduced it with a pie graph. There are addicts, there are family and friends of addicts, and there are normies. And if you don't know what a normie is, you're a normie. And I started to get a sense that everyone in the room had some connection to it. And I asked for a show of hands, how many of you have had your lives impacted by addiction? 100% of the people in that room raised their hands. So I think this is the time to start having the talk. And I'm excited to be able to be part of it.
I think it's amazing. And I'm so glad that, you know, we can highlight where you're bringing it into another space. And because we're not talking about this. It touches every branch of our lives, and we can't just fix it in one sphere. We have to, we have to take care of all of it. Because think about like the construction industry. Like, all right, I'm going to be completely selfish. Think about the safety that's involved, and their safety, our safety, the building, like there's so many things that are really, this is critical, and people don't look at it in the same way, like buildings are just as important as surgeons. Like it may be more important sometimes when they come down on you. Like you want the person that's building them to be doing well. So thank you.
Well, and my husband actually is a general contractor. And I mean, he has done construction pretty much since he was super young. And I remember when we had our first kids, we had twins first. My mom took the role of him at night because safety, I wanted him when he's walking on walls, setting trusses. I was like, you have to be all there, not mentally tired. And we're just talking sleep. We're not talking drugs, alcohol, like the whole nine. But that was a huge component where I was like, you need to sleep because I need you alive.
Right.
And so we live in an area where, illicit drugs, prescription drugs is where our problem is. We have a very affluent community here. We have a lot of elective procedures happening. We have a lot of parents who aren't really parenting and a lot of kids getting really curious. And that's a big, big problem. Yeah. We did really well we scared the shit out of our kids when it came to meth. I'm not even kidding you. The billboards that we have, you will look at it and read it and you're like, fuck no, I'm not touching that shit. But we stopped at meth.
Yep.
Where we have stuff happening in the high school where we had this guy, he used to be part of the DEA, busted one of the biggest coke rings or something of that effect. He ended up having to go into hiding with his family for years because they wanted to kill him, the whole nine. And during that time, he was like, if I can reach these kids before they get to be drug lords, like, and try to maneuver that future path in any way, shape, or form, I want to do it. And he came to Bozeman. He had a session for kids and a session for parents. And the session for the kids was kind of giving his background, basically giving he's like, I'm very credentialed in all of this. I'm here to help. He would go over, other things that he was like, I was trying to pull out kids wanting to come and confide in me, basically. And so he was like, I'll be in this classroom, for a couple hours. So he did that. And then he would have the parent meeting, and the parent meeting, he starts writing these phrases on the board. And he was like, do you all know what any of this means? And they're like, it was like backpacking, a fishbowl party. And the parents are like, no, I have no idea. He's like, well, backpacking is where your kids are soaking tampons in vodka and they're shoving it up their ass to go to school because they don't smell, the whole night. He's like, so this is happening to your kids. He was like, fishbowl parties are where your kids are taking 17 prescription bottles to a party, dumping them in a bowl. They take a handful and leave. He was like, you guys did phenomenal on meth. He's like, but your prescription drug problem is through the roof. He was like, and either you're not parenting by monitoring what you have, or he was like mind blown. And we are a very small community, but he was like, y'all you need to do better. Like, and especially to the parents. And I just, from growing up with a mom who was not there mentally, she wasn't there emotionally, she wasn't there physically. You talk about having to call the casinos. That was me at 2:30 in the morning calling the bars. I literally had their numbers memorized. And it was, is Pat there? Is Pat there? Until I found her and then asked her when she was coming home. And then there were nights where she wasn't anywhere and didn't come home for 3 days. So I look at the parenting aspect of all of this, especially with our kids. And I'm like, man, like we have a job, and that just coincides with the fact that we have to talk about this. My kids have to know what I went through as a kid and as an adult. Like, if I'm not telling them these things, it doesn't exist until all of a sudden we have a problem that no one talks about. And they think they're the only ones, which is exactly where I was with my drinking.
And I think like with meth, we use the fear tactic, and that only
100%.
takes you so far, because as a kid, if you told me don't do it, guaranteed I was going to do it. Meth, I was afraid to do because it was going to make my face look funny, and I didn't want that. But I think having the conversations that most addiction, not all, but most addiction is rooted in pain. And as humans, we all have pain. And so we start by normalizing conversations around mental health. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be depressed. It's okay to be anxious. This is what it feels like. And when kids start hearing that, and then they know it's safe to feel yucky, and then they have information about what these drugs can do, I think that's where some of the power is. I'm terrified with my daughter entering middle school next year because I know what's out there. But I'm so thankful that I'm on my recovery journey and can at least provide her information and resources and be fully present during this. But it's terrifying.
Well, and I've included my kids on my recovery journey. I think that's very important.
How old were your kids when you included them?
Not until they could actually understand. So like when they were babies, I mean, that was actually the peak of my addiction, honestly. But like, for example, I just celebrated 10 years and my family is with me, surrounding me, and we all have the number 10. Like, so like they know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And I think that that's absolutely huge. And it's funny, my twins suffer from just adolescent migraines. And man, it hits them like a ton of bricks. They feel like crap. They throw up. And I literally looked at them and I was like, this is what it feels like to be hungover. Just FYI. And they're like, oh my God.
I don't want this.
And I was like, you are literally experiencing how trashy you feel after you drink too much. I was like, so just know that, like you're kind of asking for it if you decide to do it, but I'm never going to shame them. Like my kids are probably going to want to be kids at some point, but they have this foundation where I know for a fact that our communication is so open that the minute that happens, or the minute there's something that they're kind of questioning, we're able to talk about it, which I think is huge. But again, going back to your point, it's because we talk about it.
Yes.
And it's on all these different levels, in the home,
yes,
in the business, in the industries. Like there's this layered effect that we've got to start talking about it more.
absolutely. And there's this invisible line with any addiction that I believe you don't see it. It's invisible, and you don't know you crossed it until you're on the other side. And so with my kids, my hope is I can prevent them from ever crossing that invisible line. But if I can't, and they do cross it, I can lend them a hand and bring them back to the other side. They don't have to live in that shame and guilt for, decades. There's a way out, and there's power in that. And congratulations on 10 years. That's amazing.
Thank you.
And Heather just had her 7 years. We're like all over the place with this.
Congratulations to you too.
Thank
Love
you.
that.
And my son was graduating, so I forgot about it.
Oh, that's a good reason to forget.
It was a great
100%.
reason.
I
Yeah.
That
told her,
just means it's part of your normal life now.
when you forget about your sober anniversary, that means that you are really good where you're at, in my opinion.
It was so funny. So there's a woman I met in the program who we shared the exact same birth date. Like we were born on the same day. And she sends me a message and says, happy birthday. And I was like, our birthday's not till August. She was talking about my sobriety date, because that's, like she is amazing and wrote it down. And I was like, huh.
That's awesome.
Okay. But I am celebrating at the end of the month. So there is time to come.
Good for you. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
And I know we have to wrap this up. This conversation's been great, and I could probably go on for hours because I have so many questions, but I wanted to make sure that Heather and Meredith got their questions in. I think the thing with you and we're doing so much in the construction industry, and we're really trying to squash that stigma, especially with the webinar that we're going to be doing in a couple of weeks. Do you feel that these conversations that we have with our children, and the conversations that are out there to educate people on opioids, because I know that is a huge thing in the construction industry because of injuries and everything else, they get hooked so easily on this stuff. Do you feel that the education earlier on, even before somebody gets into the construction industry, would possibly help?
Oh, for sure.
If they, you know what I mean? Like getting this stigma squashed is so important, and it needs to happen at an earlier age. I feel like we just need to get it out in the open so these kinds of things don't happen. The whole reason why I got into the construction industry is not just because of the construction and engineering global business unit I worked with, but one of my colleagues who introduced me to ABC, it was in his family had opioid use, and it ended up in a, and died by suicide. So it's rampant. And I feel like if there's earlier education, earlier talking about it, peer support, people being open, it will benefit us so much.
I think we should absolutely be talking about it. And I think as a country, we made a huge mistake, as we often do. The pendulum shifts so far to the extreme on issues. All of a sudden there's an opioid crisis. So people who need the medication can't get it. It's well intended, but it's not the drug that's the problem. You need to know the risks of the drug. You need to understand how the drug works. And so if we start, I would love, like in a perfect world, to see in middle school and high school and health classes talking about these things, educating kids, giving them information. Don't do the, drugs are bad, like the fried egg campaign that some of us may have had. Sorry, this cat's claws are digging into me. As kids, don't think that's going to scare kids away. Like I saw eggs in a pan and thought, okay, you guys are a bunch of idiots. Let's go get high. Give them the risk factors. Let them know what it looks like. Empower parents to know what their genetic risk factors are. Most addiction is rooted in trauma, genetics, and environment. Give kids that information so they can make good informed choices, because we're not going to change what they have access to. They're going to find everything out there.
Yep, for sure.
What an amazing conversation. Yeah, it
Thank
parallels
you
so
guys
much. Yeah, absolutely.
I
Thank
told
you.
Dana when I listened to your story, I was like, oh my God, I can relate on so many levels. Yeah. And same with you, Meredith. It's powerful. But it's a beautiful place to be on this side.
It is.
I
And
know
now, oh, sorry, Dana. I was going to say, now we
gonna-
get to be there for our kids and change the conversation and change the, like, we get to be the cycle breakers,
Yes.
and Dana's a step parent. Dana's part of that too. Like, we all get to be the cycle breakers in our communities, in our families, in our jobs, in our wherever we speak about this.
And that's not an easy job, but I truly now view it as an honor. Like, I'm so thankful I get to be that person, which that surprises me to say. It's taken me a long time to get here, so I'm just thrilled to be here now.
Okay. And I know that we're going to have you back to have a whole episode of you and Meredith talking about the brain and all of the
Oh, I
good
would
stuff
love
goes on with the
that.
neuro.
I would love that. I'll geek
I'm
out with
into
you
it
all
too.
day.
That's what I do with my work. I trigger it. I don't just
There you
research
go.
it. I trigger it with art and expressive therapies.
Yeah, that's a whole other fascinating.
It's a
Yeah.
big theme of
Huge.
our interests. Yeah, we
Mhm.
really love
Well, the whole disease
the
model of
neuroscience.
addiction, I didn't buy that when I went through my
Mhm.
first round. I thought when people called addiction a disease, it was an excuse to justify bad behavior. And it wasn't until I really dove into the research that I understood it is. And the effects that it has on the brain, and even after abstinence and sobriety and recovery, the rewiring process is lengthy. So I'd love to geek out with you guys about that
Oh
topic.
yeah.
Mhm.
Let's do
And the
it.
need for dopamine to because a lot of
Yes.
people are dopamine deficient for whatever reasons, and so they need those healthy dopamine kind of boosts so that they don't switch addictions, because that's
Well,
the
and
big.
dopamine is what triggers the gambling. And it's the same as opioids. You get to a certain level and then you need more to maintain that level. So now you have to up it to the next level. And then all of a sudden you're through the roof.
Right. So that
Well,
when you
and-
take away the addiction, now your brain is up here and
Oh,
it
yeah.
needs that. So how do you, so a lot of people put sugar in there, a lot of people put work in there, a lot of people put whatever it is. And that's where we start getting, yeah.
And statistically, the first dopamine hit that you get from an addictive substance, action, porn, gambling, whatever the case may be, is the strongest dopamine hit that you will ever get doing that thing. And that is what you are always chasing.
Yep.
And that blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, because it releases so much new dopamine to your system. And then that reward circuit every time, it's not quite as high. And that's why you're constantly trying to
Yeah.
get to that first level.
That's why with gambling, the
mind-blowing.
worst thing that can ever happen is someone wins.
Yep.
Because guaranteed you will always be chasing that win. And if you don't
Yep.
get it, then you're, trying to recoup the loss.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes. Well, thank you
Okay.
ladies so much
To be
for having me.
continued.
This was
Yes.
so much fun. Thank you.
of course.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for being here.
All right,
Thank
great meeting you all, and
you.
I'll see you again. Bye.
Bye.
All right. She hopped off. Stop
Yeah.